Greetings, everyone. Of course, let me start by apologizing for the late start. We had just a little technical glitch getting connected to YouTube, but here we are and we're happy to have you. Welcome to yet another webinar from us here at the Academy of Arts, Letters, Culture and Public Affairs at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. Here at the Academy, we are home to a Master of Arts program in Carnival Studies. And so conversations such as the one we are about to be engaged in naturally find a home here. Our very own Assistant Professor, Keller Francis, will lead us in a conversation on the legacy and future of rebellion in the Trinidad and Tobago Carnival. Joining her are three remarkable women who will, with her, interrogate the call on the Divine Mothers in this digital age to lead us into revolution. They are Abayo Jackson. Abayo is a multidisciplined artist from Trinidad and Tobago, actor, acting coach, writer, dancer, choreographer, radio and television host, creative producer, as well as a theater producer with an acting for film, master's graduate with distinction from the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in London. She has over 25 years experience in various elements of the performing arts and over 15 years experience in various elements of mass communications and media. Attila Springer is a Trinidad-born essayist, juveist, DJ, and flag woman. She is a director of Idakeda Group, a collective of women in her family creating cultural interventions for social change, especially among women and youth in Trinidad and Tobago, and is also one of the conveners of Say Something, a Trinidad-based media advocacy and coalition group working on issues of gender-based discrimination. She has a long-standing interest in social justice movements, using carnival and other indigenous festival arts as forms of protest or awareness building. Anila Bhagwat has been involved in Indian culture from birth as a member of the Hindu Prachar Kendar, a dynamic Hindu organization which sought to highlight a local contextual understanding of Hindu culture and practices, one that was deeply rooted to the Trinidadian experience. She is currently co-director, along with her husband, Arvind Singh, of the Center for Indic Studies, an organization which seeks to highlight the diversity of Indian knowledge systems and their applicability to present-day issues. She has a BSc in government from UE, an MA in South Asian Area Studies, and an MPhil in sociology. And of course, our very own Dr. Kayla Narka Francis, assistant professor at UTT in the Academy, carnivalist, carnival researcher. She earned a PhD in Caribbean literature from Howard University in 2012 and continues to research topics in Caribbean literature, culture, and society. She's partially interested in the secular rituals. She is particularly interested in the secular rituals in the Caribbean and the wider African diaspora. Welcome again. I hand you over now to Dr. Francis.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. It's my duty as moderator to first explain what this panel really will be discussing. So today, I want to start by saying part of Carnival's history is rebellion. Part of Carnival's history and its endurance is spiritual rejuvenation. Both of these aspects rely on communal interaction, on people jamming with people. Faced with the new normal of social distancing and other public health precautions, how do we continue the carnival of ritual and rebellion? Is going digital a possibility? Can we ensure that the humanizing goal of carnival is preserved? In the face of global struggles, can we call on this revolutionary spirit of carnival, the divine mothers, who creates social and spiritual balance. When George Floyd cried out to his mother as he struggled for breath, as he lay dying, a mother who had been dead for 2 years, he was calling out to the ancestors, to divine motherhood, a call that resonated in every mother, every woman, a call that resonates with us. And like Chrisan said, today I'm honored to be joined by 3 young women, Abeo Jackson, Attila Springer, and Anila Bagwat, in deep conversation about carnival, rebellion, spirituality, and the new normal. Our world in turmoil, a pandemic, civil unrest at home and abroad, and a call for reckoning and reparations for myriad social inequalities. And I want to welcome ladies. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Kayla. Really appreciate being here.
Right. And one note for our audience, this is a roundtable discussion. So this might not be what you're used to. We're not here to lecture to you. We're not here to talk at you. What we want is for the audience to be able to participate. Now, given our technology at the moment, that would mean typing in your responses to the questions that we are going to be discussing. Indicate the question that you're responding to. Or if you have further questions for us as a panel, feel free to type those in and we will try to address as many as possible in the time we have. So we will be starting, there were a series of questions and we're just going to go through the questions and we will have a lively, informative, edutational is my favorite word, discussion about these different topics. So the first question I'm going to pose to the panel. Anyone jump in? What does rebellion mean to you? Is it different than protest? How is it different?
Don't all rush.
Go through hard to learn.
Oh gosh, why are you doing that? I would say that rebellion is the idea and protest is a manifestation of the idea. So you can have a protest as part of your rebellion, but it's not the full thing. You know, rebellion takes place in multiple ways. And the first point of rebellion is, of course, your mind. And then the second point of rebellion is your body. And so if we look through the history of the region, we'll see that people have used their bodies to resist, to rebel against various forms of tyranny against our bodies. And carnival, of course, is one of those very central versions of how we rebel against the strictures that are placed on us by a society that was not set up to see us as fully human. So yeah, that's my short answer.
My short answer pretty much is a version of what Tilla would have just said in terms of protest as part of rebellion and resistance, which informs a conversation we were having before we went live with Keller in terms of rebellion being part of revolution, a further something revolution, with the idea of revolution being continuous, and that rebellion and resistance, that protest is the means through which rebellion and resistance happens. It could take various forms, demonstrations, written lobbying through various mediums, boycotts. And of course, now with the change of technology, we have whole new ways that we can take forms of protest in terms of the use of social media, which is interesting to introduce into the conversation if we're talking about carnival as rebellion and what it means in this new normal, in terms of people saying things like the carnival will be online, which, you know, we could further interrogate, which I'm still not quite sure how I feel about it. Rebellion and protest, however, I think it's informative that we must say that it has to take the language and shape of the group that or the community or the entity on whose behalf it advocates. It is not going to sound or look different from the issue to which it speaks. And it is always most effective when it is that kind of authenticity. Otherwise, it just becomes, it has that disingenuous performativeness that is ineffectual and just generally feels off. So yeah, short answer.
So I sort of look at rebellion as resistance, as also opposed to revolution, which I feel is like an overthrowing of something, that you have like a sort of dialectic change, you know, but that in resistance in rebellion there is resistance. And what I see in Carnival is cultural persistence as a form of resistance. And that's what it expresses. It expresses that we are here and our bodies are here. And despite everything that has sort of been imposed on us to take that away, that's not going away, that our bodily persistence is our resistance. And that's sort of what I sort of think Carnival really represents now. Yeah.
There's some interesting words coming up here. From Attila, we're talking about mind first, then body. We're talking about body and inhabiting a space. And that's Carnival. Your body inhabits a space saying, I am here, my culture is here, and as a form of resistance. And then with Abeyo talking about authenticity. And we've dovetailed actually into our second question. What do you understand rebellion in Carnival to be? And I like how we are flowing. And I want to keep that going. In the last webinar, there were two interesting points that came up. And I think they tie in with your idea of mind first, then body, language of the group that needs to protest, that authenticity that we're striving for. So one of the things when we were talking about policy is that education needs to be part of that policy. People don't actually know what Carnival is. And what was striking in that conversation as well is Dr. Burke brought up a study they did in 2017 when they polled people what was important about Carnival. And a lot of them talked about fetting. And so what we have then, if we don't have the education and we have people veering towards what they see being promoted as fetting. So building on the idea of mind first, we don't have the education, so we're not developing the mind for rebellion and protest. We're using the body to occupy a different space. And is there resistance in that or not? And again, I'm just throwing out evil questions to you all, for you all to ruminate on and think about as we discuss. So I want to bring in question 3 one time. And do you think rebellion is still in Carnival in any shape or form? If we're talking about fetting being the most important thing in Carnival, if we're talking about the fact we don't teach either history or function of Carnival, is rebellion still there?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes?
Yes. I know what else to say. I mean, if you can't see it, then you're not looking for it.
Yeah.
It's, I think that also we need to make the point that we do get educated about Carnival. We get educated about the fact that the French had a carnival. We don't get educated about the fact that Africans had masking traditions, or that Indians had stick fight. These are the things that we do not get educated about. And so it's not that we don't get educated about, we don't get educated about ourselves and ourselves in the, because I mean, obviously, who wants people to rebel against them? You know?
So
Yeah. You see,
when I was telling my friends about this, and I was telling them about the panelists, and they said, Attila Springer is going to be one of the panelists, and I really admire her. I've been reading her since I was like in high school, and then they're like,
"Oh God, I'm old."
No, you're not old. Late high school, right? Last year, so Form 6. So then they asked who's Attila Springer, and I'm like, well, how else to go away from your legacy, right? She's Pearl N2's daughter. And their next question was, who's Pearl N2? And I'm like, I'm ashamed, because really we do not know anything about ourselves. And these are people with university degrees, So I was just, I don't know, I was blown away by how much we don't know about ourselves. And but what I was thinking is that in our state building exercise, that there has been the kind of adoption of carnival as intrinsic to the framing of the nation state, and how then can rebellion against the state, happen when the state has aggressively adopted and controlling the narrative around what this festival is. And there has been education, because you're right, we learn about it in school, but we don't know anything about ourselves and our own involvement in these processes. So things like Indian stick fighting is something that people don't know about. The jab and Kali sort of traditions that go together. That there's these families in Karapi Chima who for generations have been, carrying on jab tradition, and they've been Kali worshippers. And they represent like a liminal space in the Trinidad community, but also in the Indian community, because as Kali worshippers, they're sort of occupying, not a mainstream Hindu or Indian space. So those are the kinds of things that we really don't know about ourselves, how complicated we are.
For me, it's interesting that point you made in terms of the state's vested interest in Carnival, and how can the state, how can there be rebellion within the Carnival, or maybe rebellion and resistance as we have come in our minds, I suppose, to stereotype it, because sometimes we think rebellion and resistance is supposed to look a certain way, and we paint things as a monolith. But it is very interesting that you raised that point, and it takes us all the way back in terms of why it emerged in the first place, in terms of dealing with identity, and the fact that when the rebellion happened, it was because they were pushing back against this entity as they fought for the against establishment, against status quo. So there is that dichotomy that we have to remember. That for me, there are two different carnivals. There's the carnival that is the festival, that is the performative, that is the one that capitalism stands on the back of. How can we package it? How can we commercialize it? How can we make money? And then there is still the carnival that we still don't see, which is what I think Tilla is talking about, where she says, if you don't see it, then it's probably not for you. You are probably not looking hard enough. You know what I mean? So there's that other, the other carnival, maybe the original, the most authentic, the one that still exists in its purest forms, where she talks about the parallels between Kali and Jab, and then there are those who don't even understand the traditional African energies that resonate when we start to talk about Pan and the evolution of Pan and all that kind of stuff. I mean, because capitalism has decided that version of carnival is not the one that is marketable. It's the one that they've decided is not attractive enough. We can't exoticize it. We can't, objectify it, so to speak. So it's always interesting when we hear when there are very long, in-depth conversations as we talk about the marketability of carnival, that always somehow tries to actively avoid talking about the roots of rebellion and resistance and authenticity that comes in in the festival, and the fact that we have actively tried to gentrify it over the years. But I think this year is going to be a really interesting year because of the fact that we are in the midst of COVID again on, and it's going to force us to strip things back. It's going to force us to pull the frill and the extra spectacle and the glitz and the exoticism away from it and take it back, I think, into the communities, especially in light of what is happening right now in terms of globally, what we've been started calling the reckoning, this whole return to Pan-Africanism and solidarity across the diaspora and all that kind of stuff as it pertains to social justice. And what we saw erupt right here in Trinidad and Tobago just a few weeks ago before the election bell was tolled. I think all those things are going to play into the tone that Carnival takes this year, as we try to figure out exactly what shape it's going to take. In fact, we're not going to be able to figure out what shape it takes. It's just going to happen just very organically. At least that's how I feel about it.
I want to add into it. We got some questions here. Priyanka, I hope I'm saying your name right. Kants? Priyanka asks, does the reduction of corporate interests help bring Carnival back to its rebellious roots? So we talked a little bit about state control, but we also have a level of corporate control where they choose who they sponsor. The people they don't sponsor, quote unquote, disappear. So it's an interesting question, especially as you're talking about authenticity, going back to its roots and so on. So does a reduction of corporate interests help bring Carnival back to its rebellious roots?
I just want to say a couple of things. So go back to something that Anila was saying about the co-opting of Carnival by the state, which means that, say, if you're playing Midnight Rubber, you just get a parent's fee from the NCC that you have to wait for until maybe next year. Or if you are a panelist, you have to, long time, the culture of the artist as an independent figure in their community. You would have people who were itinerant workers. Maybe they were stevedore or whatever it is they used to call it down on the wharf. They used to thief. They were criminals. They were seen as criminals anyway. Their bodies were seen as criminal bodies anyway. So everything about them was criminal, but they would spend time saving their money, their little bit of money, whether it was on a susu or giving it to their mother to hold or whatever. And they would put together and they would buy their materials or make their materials or spend like a year making this mask to come out and play this mask on Monday and Tuesday, right? And they knew that their income for the next few months was going to be determined by how well they played their mask, right? So you have to be the baddest Midnight Rubber on the road. Your speech have to be so top of top that people are just going to give you their money. Your devil have to be so devilish that people have to be imagining the flames of hell that will descend on them, right? So that idea of the artist as an independent person in the Carnival space has all but disappeared, right? And that's something that we need to address. If we're saying that corporate sponsorship and state occupation of cultural forms is a challenge and a problem, right?
Yeah, Tilla, I agree with you because there was a turning point in the Carnival where it went from that you were just talking about there in terms of being the baddest and the wickedest and the dreadest of your own accord, and the reward being bragging rights. Of course, you're making money, you're bragging rights and earning the respect and the reverence of
your community,
people within your community. The government, the establishment found a way to control the rebellion and the Carnival and remove that from it by introducing competition. That was the way in which they were able to control it. And I think we're coming to a point in Trinidad Carnival where competition seems to be coming, I don't want to say to an end, but it seems as though the masses have become greatly disinterested in it. And as a result, corporate has become disinterested in it kind of thing. But it is, as Keller said, in terms, and according to the question, will corporates having to pull back because of the situation we are in right now bring back some of the rebellion? I think definitely some of the resistance, which is not to say the resistance wasn't there. It just means it may be able to be more overt, and it will be represented in bodies and voices that you don't usually see or hear as often in the mainstream, because classism and colorism.
I also want to say, sorry. Sorry. I also want to say something about the whole idea of what corporate sponsorship looks like as well. Because it's not like you have an arts council where if I want to teach 500 children how to make masks, I can go and apply to an arts council for money, and they see the value of the work, the transformative work of the arts in communities, and so they give you the support to do that. No, there's a kind of attitude towards giving support and sponsorship to the arts, which is more about the corporate sponsor getting bragging rights than it is about the artists benefiting from the multiple millions of profits people are making on poor people every year.
Hey, you.
Right? I'm sorry, again, I'm getting loud.
Girl preach. Girl preach.
But this is
right.
This is a difference in your approach. We do not have a culture of philanthropy in this country. We do not have a culture of, supporting, patronage, supporting artists as people who are creating, people who are working all the time to help us make sense of this chaos that we are living in right now. Right? This is what artists are doing for us. If it was not for the filmmakers, for the musicians, none of us would have survived COVID, right? But we do not have a culture of supporting these people who are making it possible for us to see beauty when there is chaos.
So I want to go back and just add, and you talk about going a little back to the discussion of state and state sponsorship. And then we'll come forward to corporate sponsorship. Actually, they're kind of intertwined. The competitions which were introduced during colonial era, turn of the century, 1900s, was a way of anesthetizing, prettifying, cleaning up what they thought was a devilish, quote unquote, African expression on the streets. It was a way of bringing in a European or Eurocentric aesthetic into the mass. And actually, this is where we start to see, quote unquote, mass start to come out, right? So we actually had a period before independence where competition sparked creativity, but we were shifting very slowly away from an African aesthetic into a European aesthetic. This is one of the things we don't talk about. And I'll bring up the question after this. That's so many things we don't talk about. So we don't talk about how our aesthetics were shaped by colonialism. We don't talk about that. And this is part of what we mean by education. And I agree with you, not education in terms of indoctrination, but the true meaning of education, educat, out of darkness, enlightenment about ourselves. The things we are moving towards, it was a revolution that was happening that may have fallen by the wayside. Probably, actually, most teachers would tell you it kind of fell by the wayside. So I want to make the point, by the time our state, the post-colonial state, got involved, it was a very strange dual process of trying to foster a national identity. That was the original vision, to foster a national identity. But at the same time, because it's coming out of the ideology of nationalism, it was a homogeneic national identity. It wasn't really allowing the different ethnicities play to be themselves. It was supposed to be a flat thing. And one of the mistakes we make is that we assume that Trinidad's natural or default culture is African or Black. It's not, it's European. When you going for an interview and you dress for your job, do you put on a shalwar? Do you put on a sari? Do you put on a dashiki? Do you put on an agbada? Or do you put on a European suit? The language we're speaking right now, and the better we speak it, the more prestige we get. And so on and so on and so on. The default is not. And so when we talk about Carnival and we try to elevate it, we want to talk about it being French because we assume that's the more sophisticated. So we will say, oh yeah, it came from the French. And we actually have one of the comments in the feed talking about it was originally a masquerade ball celebrated in the European upper classes.
But I mean, but if you want to split hairs, then you can say that actually in pre-pagan times in Europe, well, not even in pre-pagan times, in pre-Christian times when it was just pagans. I mean, where were they getting their pagan rituals from? And then when the Roman influence spread across Europe, where was Rome getting their influence from? If we look at the symbology of Christianity, we'll see that it's actually ancient Egyptian. So let's talk about what African is and what African isn't, right? And if we were to go back, the thing that they're saying is European is actually African. So
that's that about that.
Talk now.
Okay. The other question, and again, tied to what we've been talking about, especially if you're thinking of rebellion of the mind first, then the body, not being educated about ourselves. And this is a question about education. What carnival education opportunities exist for foreigners outside of Trinidad, either when visiting during carnival season, required texts in Trinity schools, and series, etc. This is partly a question for me representing the Masters of Arts in Carnival Studies. So there's actually education that you can get at the tertiary level. There are a million of books. You can start with Dr. Liverpool's, and I'm not going to remember the whole title because
Rituals of Power and Rebellion.
Thank you. I should call it Rituals. It's very bad MLA handling where you just say the first word, but Rituals of Rebellion. Gives us a very good history. If we want to go farther back, we could talk about Errol Hill's mandate for a national theater. And so there has been a lot published that you can self-educate, but you can always come to UTT and enroll in the Masters of Arts and Carnival Studies if you want an official study.
The interesting thing about that question for me, I mean, I am all for making sure we control the narrative, so to speak, in terms of making sure people know the story of Carnival and how it evolved and how it continues to evolve in terms of foreigners, etc. But right now, for me, I'm more concerned about us because I still feel as though we are in a place in Trinidad, and yes, it's taught, it's on the curriculum, but I think there is issue in terms of how it's on the curriculum, and it goes back to what you were just talking about in terms of being a European society. That old quote about the story of the lion will never be glorified if it is always told from the perspective of the hunter. And if it is, we are teaching Carnival in schools from a nationalistic perspective. Nationalism is great, but it also deals a lot in erasure. It erases certain identities, especially when nationalism is our version of nationalism hasn't yet come to grips with so many of our colonial legacies. When we start to talk about law enforcement in Trinidad and Tobago, and we take it all the way back to Captain Baker and what he represented and whose interests he represented. And then we think about law enforcement right about now and how it deals with our marginalized communities, many of which play integral starring roles in the emergence of Carnival and Carnival culture. Is it any coincidence that we have this over policing and militarization in certain communities right about now. When we think of the institution and the establishment from which it descended, that we haven't begun to come to terms with what that means and how that now plays into our culture right about now on that level. There is a reason why, and I might get myself in some hot water here, but I'm going brave because whoever. There's a reason why the people who hold the rope in the band look a certain way and potentially come from certain areas. You understand what I mean? That for me is the modern day manifestation of of not dealing with our colonial legacies, of existing in a very Eurocentric society that still glorifies anything that is not African. We haven't come to terms with what that means for us as a society just yet.
I mean, I would also say, just to go back to the original question about education, that I think that the steel bands have a very successful model in terms of how a paniard operates.
Right.
And the fact that we have sidelined the steel bands as a form of conflict resolution, mediation, restorative justice, and education and empowerment of our communities is shocking. That there is no pan representative on this quote unquote road to recovery committee. Anyway, but that's not the point that I was trying to make. The point is that the Panyards have a very successful model. You could go into a Panyard tonight and leave knowing the first verse of a song. It's extremely empowering. It's not like you're picking up a violin and learning to play it, where first of all, you have to figure out how to hold it, right? You could walk into a Panyard and learn how to play a pan in one night. So it is a fast turnaround of education. But I also want to say that the whole idea of having rites of passage as part of your education is really, really important. Because when you talk about the types of mass that make rebellion and carnival important, these are the types of mass that require fasting, that require that before you started playing the mass, you have to give up sex, alcohol, drugs, meat, cussing, arguing. You know, these are the things. I mean, I remember the late great Acid stick fighter that we lost the other day, and I remember him talking about his preparation for the stick fight season. Right? It's not something that's happened by guess or by accident. I also remember a couple of years ago playing Black Indian. And yeah, you know, I am a nice educated bishop skill and thing. And I was like, oh yeah, I want to play Black Indian. You know, my great grandfather used to play Black Indian, blah, blah, blah. Okay, Andy Patrick, who is one of the last exponents of this art, the true art of Black Indian mass, which is, you know, a serious spiritual mass. He said, okay, we're going down Ikakas to look for Kobo feathers. I mean, did I think that the Kobos would very kindly leave all their feathers on the beach? I am walking on the beach like a fool looking for Kobo feathers. And then I see Andy in the distance shouting and waving. And when I reach closer, I realize that a Kobo has been electrocuted and is in the drain. And Andy is pulling the feathers out of his dead Kobo. This is part of the ritual of understanding the importance of playing this mass. I had to go through that. I could not intellectualize the thing.
And I feel like what is missing in education is storytelling, like exactly what you just did, Attila. Because like we don't get opportunities to hear these stories at all because there's no, you know, at one point, Hazel Brown had said that her role is now going to be storyteller. And I just like that you have these people who have these experiences. And when they talk, like, sometimes when you hear Ravi G speak, and he just has like all these experiences to draw from, that you sort of get what our society was, where we come from, how we're formed, just from these stories. And that's not written anywhere. It's not available to people, and it's not in our books or anything. And the other thing is there's a lack of like community understanding, like understanding where communities come from, what their histories are, what their ideologies are, and how much we may or may not have in common, where our grounding is, because there are no opportunities for people to just dialogue, or people don't see the need to dialogue because they're full on about their own selves without looking for interconnectedness or trying to find deeper stories about others. And I feel like that's really missing. Both the storytelling and intercommunal dialogue is something that just knowing these things, people don't get to know.
And I just want to say, I am eternally grateful for having somebody like Ravi G in my life who has, made certain things that I did not understand about myself so much clearer, right? And he could only do that from his perspective, his point of view. And so it's really important. I mean, that year when I played Black Indian, it was Shivratri was Carnival Tuesday. It was Carnival Tuesday. And I went home, I washed off all of this black paint, and I went to the Kendra for Shivratri. And Shivratri is an all-night thing. So I didn't sleep for about 3 days. And then I ended my carnival experience in Shivratri. Now, there are lots of people who would say that those two things don't belong together. But I think that they absolutely belong together, because it is about what is going on in the rest of the universe at this time that have nothing to do with us as small, paranoid, suspicious, central nervous systems, right? We need to move beyond that and understand that at particular times, everybody is going through something, right? Whether you are in Africa, whether you are in India, whether you are in the Caribbean, you're looking up at the sky and you seeing something. And that is trying to help you make sense of where you are in the world. And the fact that we ended up all under the same sky, we need to find a way to celebrate that and support each other as we look up at the sky and try to make sense of the thing.
So there's several things we're bringing up here. I want to go back to Ebeo and your response to the question about educating foreigners. And you said first starting with us, educating us. And I think one of the things that we need to keep reiterating when we educate ourselves about Carnival is that Carnival is an open space.
Yes, ma'am.
And I love the interaction between Anila and Attila, because that is exactly the point of Carnival. It's an open space. You bring what you need to bring to that space. You enact what you need to enact. And usually they coalesce, they coincide, and they enrich each other. And I also wanted, we're getting a question about, because we've gone off and we've talked a lot about spirituality and the rejuvenation that spirituality has in Carnival, and it's very important. But the question is, but are there economic considerations? And I've thrown this out before, and I will throw it out. You can take it, run with it, discard it however you want. But I've often used the analogy of the goose that lays the golden egg, and Carnival is the goose, and economic opportunities are these golden eggs. What do you think is there a way to balance the spiritual vitality and rejuvenation and the economic consideration of carnival?
I think the answer is not to deny that the ritual has to take place. You know, regardless of whether there are 50 fetes, certain rituals have to take place. And, you know, I mean, going to places like Nigeria and seeing how you could be driving in a road in Lagos and it have somebody in the road playing a masquerade, which looks like a banana tree, right? This person is doing their masquerade because, you know what, sometimes in particularly in Ifa tradition, you know, you have to do certain parts of your ritual have to do with masquerade. And the fact of the masquerade is actually ancestral reverence, or it might be reverence to nature, it might be reverence to the river, or it might be, you know, so it doesn't actually matter what humans doing, you know. Your connection to the divine, your connection to the forces of the universe is what is important. So car can be driving past, the car have to go around the masquerade.
Yeah.
Right? It's not about us trying to find a way to accommodate one thing in sacrifice of the next. The two things have to find a way to coexist. And this is the important thing about the time and about, you know, when we do Camboulet, the first thing that we do is we sit with the Babalao. The Babalao has to say, all right, this year, certain things need to be part of your ritual. Because you know what, people, there is always some spiritual manifestation that happens at the time. And the reality of the situation, our Babalao said to us, he said, this is ancestral work you are doing. It's not just a play. It is serious ancestral work. And if you are doing work and you are calling ancestors going to turn up. When they turn up and you don't know what to do, that is when you're in a monkey pants. And I feel like there are lots of spaces where in the carnival where you see things. I remember the year when Marshall did Toro Toro. It was Shango he was calling. But who was telling Marshall that he was calling Shango? Who was telling him? There were nights when there was a night in Fire Fest when Marshall was laying out on the back in backstage, like flat on the ground. The energy was so transformative in this Fire Fest. It's not just about a fete. The repetitive nature of the music, right? Soca is a Orisha feast, right? When you start, you know, you see the same pattern happening, and we have to be able to see those patterns happening for us to understand. You know, David Rudder says it the best. Why it is you're shaking, you don't know. But if you know, then it means that you can take your celebration and your enjoyment of the thing to a different level. Ogun is the owner of the house of money. Why I have to trade money? But it have to be in a different way that we engage with the energy of money. Because money is an important part of who we are as people. But it has to be in a different way that we engage with this thing.
So it's so interesting when you were talking about Toro, because that took me back to when Marshall and Bungie did Busted just the other day. And people were out of their minds about the lyrics of Busted, and they didn't understand the power that was in Busted. And I kept telling people, if you don't get it, then it's not for you. It's not for you.
That was a heights.
Yeah, if you didn't get it, it's not for you. Because the kind of energy that was in Busted, it was a clear, and it was such an important time and message and moment, and what the imagery and the story that they chose to tell through the video as well, in terms of with the young boy learning to stick fight, was so important. And moments like that are kind of magical within the festival. But taking it back to the question in terms of, is economics important? As Phyllis said, of course economics is important. But what we have to stop doing is letting the economics and the corporates and the state dictate the pace without consultation with the people who are the creatives and on whose backs the festival has always, not the festival, this manifestation of energy, this rebellion, this resistance, on whose backs it has always rested. We cannot expect that we're going to get an authentic version. And that's the reason why I personally think we can't ever seem to really fully market Carnival in a way that is sustainable, because of the fact that we're doing it in vacuums, we're doing it in isolations, we're seeing one thing as separate from another, and we're not finding the links in between everything, because we've forgotten the original story and the original intent of what it was for. So, I mean, yes, absolutely, the economics matter, and there are numerous opportunities for local artisans and creatives to make money and to have viable, careers and pass down, hand down skill sets, the wire bending, the panmen and them teaching the new generation of panmen, the midnight robbers and the moko jumbies, and just passing down and handing down. There is room for a whole viable industry. But because of the fact that we've allowed a very, again, going back to the idea, Eurocentric idea of what this market is supposed to look like and sound like, we have pretty much sabotaged ourselves over the years in terms of allowing the festival to do what it does naturally, and then allowing the economics to, again, organically come out of that.
Okay. I want to add to that, and especially since you brought back the idea of Eurocentrism. It has always been suspicious to me how we use money to equate value. And when we talk about investing in cultural things, the economy we're talking about is not necessarily financial. But if you have a society that is secure in its understanding of itself, even if it's a multiple self, because we are a multi-ethnic society. We have so many iterations of self here. But if we are comfortable with that, going about doing our day-to-day financial things, contributing to society becomes a lot easier. And again, Abiel, also going back to you, because you were kind of leading us into question number 5. What similarities are there between current uprisings in the US and Carnival as rebellion? So when you talk about who's holding the ropes, who are the disenfranchised people in Trinidad? And we've recently had a lot of backlash where, for some reason, people speaking out about social injustice in Trinidad simply piggybacking off of what was happening in the US. And that has, I want to say, never been the case. We have always been a Pan-Africanist state. Pan-Africanism was forged by 2 Trinidadians and Du Bois. So we have always been in there. And so the question kind of is really to explore that idea of how we bring our Caribbeanness, our Trinidadianness, our carnival into these global movements for justice, right? So do you see similarities between the uprisings and particularly we can talk about the Black Lives Matter uprisings that are going on currently? The iteration of last year or 2018, I don't know, all the years are running in together now. 2020 just seems to be 20 years long. But when we had the Me Too movement hit Carnival here, again, flashing with Rose's song.
Leave Me Alone.
Yes, Leave Me Alone, yeah.
Right. And interesting thing is that we've always had that strong feminist stance in Carnival from Jamet Carnival come forward. It's interesting how we have taken what is traditionally male tradition, masquerading is a male tradition, and we have said to hell with that, and women must be alongside men. You won't see this. It's actually it's taking off a little bit in Africa now, where you see women doing traditional masquerade, but it's something that's been happening here since before the turn of the 20th century. So looking at our rebellion and rebellions outside, are there similarities? Do you see similarities?
For me, absolutely. I mean, I think for us to think that something, the global energy, this era that the world is starting to call the reckoning, that it would happen outside of Trinidad and Tobago and it would have no ripple effects here. I think it would be very, very silly of us to think that we wouldn't feel the vibrations. But for me, in terms of the similarities between the uprisings, particularly BLM, it's because it has to do with group identity, and culture and dismantling of systems that are engineered to try to stifle that. This idea of literally, well, in the US, literally killing and brutalizing Black bodies into submission, while ensuring that marginalized spaces stay marginalized. And it again feeds back into that idea of capitalism. In the US, it's that idea of the prison system in the US feeds into a very lucrative type of industry. So it is no surprise that the prison system in the United States forms such a huge part of what is like a new manifestation of modern slavery. Because when you, I mean, again, thinking about the United States, when you look at their constitution and where it outlaws slavery, except in the case of imprisonment. So when you look at the statistics in terms of who forms the majority and the biggest makeup of the prison system in the United States, you realize that it's active modern day slavery that you have happening. And then you have what happens outside in terms of the education system, the healthcare system, access to opportunity, whether it's banking and finance, etc., etc. So when you look at what's happening out there and then you bring it back home, whereas our situation is different in terms of we don't necessarily have this majority and minority type of setup as it pertains to race demographics. We have primarily two, what you would consider ethnicities of color, but it's very interesting the polarization that happens because especially along ethnic lines, which rears its head in particular as it pertains to how we vote and our politics, because of the fact that, again, it was engineered by a colonial setup. So it makes sense then that, again, as usual, you have particular communities in this country who end up disadvantaged because we have various economies that are happening parallel to the supposed legitimate economy from which these particular communities end up being the foot soldiers. It's the direct parallel to what happens with the US prison system. So, I mean, it's finding the parallels, they are there. They are there for those who are willing to look. And you don't necessarily have to look very hard. You know what I mean? So I don't necessarily think that when I hear people say that what happened in the US is happening in the US and don't bring that here. The point is the context is already here. We already exist in a context that even though our framing may be a little bit different, there are so many conversations that need to be had, and there are so many things that we need to do in terms of trying to unpick those things as it pertains to classism, as it pertains to geography and othering. Because even we, I always say all skin ain't kin, because even us who come in this packaging, some of us have to acknowledge our privilege. So
there are lots of Black Karens out there.
Hey you, hey you, and Suzanne's and Chad's.
And
So,
I want to bring in Anila because I don't know how, it's not a different perspective, but it might be in a more nuanced perspective. When you look at Carnival, which I think pretty much is we've all accepted as a Trini thing, and some of us linking our rebellion with that kind of rebellion, which might not on the surface look like what we're going through. And it's always good to hear as many perspectives as possible. So I don't want to put you on the spot, Anila.
No pressure.
Right? No pressure.
Talk the things.
But it's interesting to hear how, because you're and I don't want to talk for you, Anila. I'm not talking for you. I just want to hear your perspective. No? Come on.
Yeah.
I'm not here to share my perspective, but like on what specifically? Like on what?
We're talking now about Carnival, rebellion, and the similarities we're seeing with the global uprising. We're talking specifically about Black Lives Matter, but I will bring in, there was a lovely interview by, getting Roy.
Arundhati.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. My brain is dying today. And apparently sparked from the movement in America, in India, for example, there is quote unquote a Dalit Lives Matter movement going on. And there's this connectivity now that we're seeing globally. So I think I will expand it beyond Carnival. There's a connectivity we're seeing globally where the disenfranchised or the people who feel disenfranchised are using this rebellious energy. And the rebellious energy in Trinidad manifests in Carnival. We sing when we protest. We march and we dance. It's not a static thing. And so we're looking at how all this kind of energy is playing out throughout the world. And it'll be interesting to hear, because there are similarities and there are differences. So I want to bring in as many perspectives as possible. And I'm throwing you on the spot because you have the potential to bring in a completely different perspective as we're talking.
I think no, it's so difficult sometimes to unpack like race in Trinidad. So I would say that the Indian Trinidadian community, and particularly the Hindu Trinidadian community, should find, well, I should feel it should find a deep kind of connection to the Black experience in America as a minority culture. But I don't know, because of how race is framed in Trinidad, if people are willing to see the sort of similarities in experience of two marginalized communities, So that is something that is a big question to unpack here, and by both communities here, both by the Indian community and the Afro-Trinidadian community, whether they can find solidarity in the Black Lives Matter movement. But in terms of like a Caribbean connection, like I could see the rebelliousness of Carnival then taking up that space outside of Trinidad in Labor Day parades, in Notting Hill Carnival, and so on, because this is we have created like a diasporic identity. That's what we are. Like Pan-Africanism, I don't know if it could have come from anywhere but here. And in fact, like that's something I say about Gandhi as well, is that I don't know if India would have be able to have a independence movement that would have been able to bring the whole nation together if Gandhi did not have the South African experience, where he was able to see himself as part of a diasporic community and not just a Gujarati of whatever caste, of, you know, whatever, but as an Indian who is being, you know, stamped upon a colonial system, that is with that diasporic identity that he's able to go back to India and create like an idea for United Nation. And similarly for like a Pan-Africanist sort of, I mean, you know, things are happening outside of Africa, happening in the diaspora, in metropolitan locations like London, where you have people like James and Padmore who would be having meetings with Kenyatta and influencing, you know, the independence movement of states in Africa, and it was coming from us, you know. So I see that influence of Caribbean identity that's able to bring many things together. Because James talks about our very close communities because we're so small. That because we're so small, we're able to see how things work, how power works, how hierarchy works, because we're such small societies that we're then able to export these things. So that's where I see and why we should also be invested in the BLM movement outside of here, because we have diasporas that are directly affected by that, by what's going on there. And we have, for, I mean, decades, influenced minority culture in the US. So, whereas I don't know, but what I feel is really Trinidad is I don't know if people are ready to talk about unpacking race to find solidarity between communities here. I don't know, they're so blinded by it that, you know, yeah.
I think it's really interesting, those parallels that you just drew. And it again takes us back to the fact that the dude who would have come up with the idea, not come up, but coined the phrase institutional racism, who was so influential in the shaping of the Black Power movement in the US, was Stokely Carmichael, who came from Belmont, born and raised in Belmont. And I was having a conversation with one of my mentors, Wendell Manwaring, and that I mean, I always kind of bristle a little bit when people ask me if I'm an activist, and I always say, no, I'm an artist and an advocate, because I feel those two things go together. And a lot of the work that I've done since being back at home in Black Box with Tricanal, using Rapso, using the arts and creativity to actively comment on what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago, and assist in my own self-awareness and development as an artist. That is something that is so uniquely us. We are very self-aware people, which is why something like Carnival would have emerged in the first place. We were always very clear about fighting for our identity, so to speak, this and fighting against establishment and fighting against the erasure of our traditions and our culture and our spirituality and all that kind of stuff. And I think that could possibly be to the reason why the energy that is happening around the world right now resonates so much with us here in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, because in a way it's we are integral in terms of where the genesis, where it came from, so to speak. I mean, when you think about the fact that many people in the United States they are second generation, third generation Caribbean people with Caribbean roots or roots on the African continent, etc. It is, I don't understand sometimes how people cannot see the need, why solidarity across the diaspora is so important, because finding the links are so easy. The links are there. They're easy to identify. So, yeah.
So
what's interesting to me though with Roy particularly, sorry, is that while while there, like, on one side, there's like an Indian intellectual movement, it's so divided, it's so complicated. The sort of Indian, sort of the politics of the intellectual movements in India and politics of identity, that Roy can find value in like a Pan-Africanist identity, right? But when it comes to to the same in terms of an Indian identity, I don't think that she would ever be in support of it, because there's so many cleavages, and all that's seen are the cleavages. And the thing with the Indian experience in Trinidad is that often we ignore the cleavages, and I think it's just where we're located and how we were brought here, that we ignore the cleavages to see like a wider sort of way of identifying ourselves in a more homogenous way.
I mean, sorry, Anila, I've seen those cleavages. I remember years ago working with Gael, and we went to do something completely unrelated in Moruga.
Yeah.
And on the way out of Moruga, we happened upon a Kali temple that was having puja.
Yeah.
Right. I was the only person. It was a meat-free temple.
Okay.
And since I was the only person who was a vegetarian, I was allowed to go in and see the proceedings. But one of the things that happened as part of us encountering this temple is that there were other people, other Indians in the community, who came to us kind of conspiratorially and said, don't go by them people, it have a proper temple up the road. So it's like, this is a legitimate version of the thing. And this is the folk version of the thing. And so those,
this is even like what goes on with how Carnival is represented, right? There's a need to clean things up to appear very middle class and proper. And it happens across the board. So what also happens in terms of Indian culture and Hindu identity, there's a need to clean up things, which includes sort of doing the things that we did on sanctions, like that they aren't like they're not sanctioned things to do. So a lot of like Kali worship is one thing, but a lot of folk practices that are now no longer even practiced in the Indian community, which are things like that they used to do deep puja before you build anything or settle on any space of land, and that will mean worshiping the land deity. But to do that, you have to offer some rum and light a cigarette and kill a chicken and do that kind of thing. You're offering those things to the deity, right? But that's not done anymore, because in terms of cleaning up the faith to make us look more respectable and for all sorts of reasons, to fit in here, because the people are going to go, look at these Indian people doing all this like mad.
It's obvious, but you see, but it comes back to our understanding of what obia is.
Yeah.
And I always point out to people that in the last few years, there were actually 2 pundits who were arrested under the obia laws in Antigua.
Yes.
Right? Because anything that is not Christian is then, not proper. But arguably the biggest obia house in Trinidad is Mount St. Benedict, right? But anyway, that's not what we come here to talk about. But I wanted to point out, I wanted to invoke Claudia Jones, right? Claudia Jones, that person just agreed.
No. Sorry, that is probably Shal in the corridor. Ignore.
Okay. I wanted to invoke Claudia Jones because Claudia Jones said something really important, which was that people's art is the genesis of their freedom, right? And the fact remains that regardless of where you are in the world, if you have a protest going on, you're going to want to sing, you're going to want to dance, you're going to want to make noise, you're going to want to reach that transcendental point that you reach in your ritual space, your ecstatic space, to release yourself from the strictures of your ego and your personal shame that you might feel, right? And become part of the human mass and become part of this this larger performance of identity, which is not about individualism. It is about the community coming together to make a point about something that's going on. And so if we see similarities, it's because all of us are having a human experience, you know, and we have to acknowledge, and we have to see that every time we have, as a society, stood up for certain things. I mean, think about Cambule riots. It wasn't just that it was a riot, it was that people were standing up for their right to express their culture. And if you think also about the about Jose massacre that happened, you had people who walked from all over the country. So people who weren't even Hindu, people who weren't Muslim, people who weren't Indian, people who, because they understood at the core that if the colonial authorities could come for them people, they could come for all of us. Right? And so this is I think this is the beauty of the thing, that there are pockets and spaces where that solidarity exists, and that the option and the opportunity for us to see those synergies, they're always there. I'm sure that at some point when you know, in St. James, for example, you have people, you didn't have everybody who came in your community who had all these skills to build a taja. So you had to go by African man to build a taja. Or the African man who had to get certain things done for his Shango ritual, he had to go by an Indian to get it done, right? So all of this subtext in our communities, we don't see, we don't hear about. The historians have no interest in it because it does not fit a wider narrative of that we were suspicious of each other. We did not collaborate. Right. We did not share anything. But I mean, some of the greatest stick fighters that this country has ever seen were Indian. The greatest. This is the reality of the situation. And there's so much great research going on now, which shows that actually, you know, a lot of the lavways that exist, they have Bhojpuri words in them, not just Creole words. They have Bhojpuri words in them. I mean, you know, there's like so much, there's so much else going on. And the whole thing about noise as value, the whole thing about making your voice heard, this is something that you see across cultures everywhere in the world. And I remember one time meeting a medieval scholar in England and telling her, you know, well, you know, my business card says Juves. And she was like, what is Juve? And because, you know, it's always a very good conversation maker, right? So I started explaining to her what Juve is, and she said, oh, that's Charivari. And Charivari is this medieval noise-making parade, like a mock parade. When you have somebody in your community who beaten his wife, you know, thieving money, etc., you would have this parade through the community, and this person would be shamed through the song. They would write a love way on the man. So I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, the fact that we still sing a song which mentions Captain Baker tells you that this is the power of the culture that you have. That one day in 1881, somebody decided I'm going to make up a song about Captain Baker, and it was so impactful that all 100 and something years later, we still singing this song. That is the power of culture. That is the power of why the protests and the movements that happen in our streets, you know, they're so crucial to us transforming our societies and challenging with the noise of our visibility, the noise of our voices, those problematic parts of our society that we need to challenge, as Abeo was very correctly talking about when she was talking about the whole thing about prison enslavement system, you know, and what is at the core of all of that is that abolitionist idea But this thing that exists at this point in this form needs to be cancelled, right? It needs to be excised. It needs to be got rid of because it is not serving the purpose of the mass.
So we're bringing up a lot of things. Anila and Attila, you all kind of touched on this, and I want to wrap it in my piled high and deep kind of way, right? So when we talk about this conversation that we need to have in Trinidad between the races, it was partly attempted during the Black Power movement. We redefine Black. But what happened? Part of the impetus was redefining Blackness. I think we went with a more UK definition. In the UK, a Black person isn't just African descent. A Black person is any non-white person. And then in Trinidad, for our movement, we added an element of class. So we weren't just looking at race, we were looking at the disenfranchised regardless of race. So, and you would see repeatedly in our history attempts for this connectivity. Because remember, for colonial rule to survive, it needed to divide and conquer. And we have not addressed that. We have not had that serious conversation you're calling. But when we use the term then in this next session, when I use the term anti-Blackness, and one of our commentators also said there's a global anti-Blackness. So when we use that term, we're not just talking about African descended. I want to go back to that 1970s definition of Blackness. And the question then is, and I've been told we're coming close to our time. So first, is anti-Blackness, we've answered this, we've answered if anti-Blackness is a problem in Trinidad. I think we can all nod our head yes.
Is water wet?
Is water wet? Is it prevalent in the carnival as we see it today?
Yes, but it depends. It depends on which one of the carnivals we're talking about. Remember, I spoke about the two different versions of the carnival, right? That grassroots version where the traditions are still alive. But if we're talking about the carnival in which the one that we market and the one that we package, then yes, because anti-Blackness is still considered not necessarily, Blackness, is not necessarily considered marketable in except that it can be exoticized, so to speak, or co-opted, or
made fun of.
Made fun of, so to speak. You know what I mean? Where it becomes a caricature of itself. And because of the fact that we do come into that whole idea of Eurocentricity, and even going back to the Black Power movement, where in the midst of the Black Power movement and talking about classism, many Black people too started dealing and unpicking that whole respectability politics thing, those whole ideas of self-contempt. Am I Black? But am I too Black? You know what I mean? I could work in the bank now, but I will make sure that my hair is straight and could go in a nice smooth one, as opposed to wearing your hair kinky or in an afro, so to speak. So I feel like Carnival, the way we package it, the anti-Blackness is representative in the fact that, yes, we acknowledge that we are a society of color prevalently, but it must be racially ambiguous color. You know, it must be that cocoa brown that has the curly hair, so to speak, that presents
Agency
as
brown.
Agency brown girl, that presents as non-threatening, so to speak. Because anything that is too Black is threatening. Because the roots of Carnival itself, the genesis of resistance and revolution and rebellion, from whence it actually came, is still too threatening. So we can't necessarily package that. So we will package a very glitzy version of it, a very gentrified version of it. It's why when you go to the fetes, you as a black, you will stand up next to your red-skinned friend and the photographer will break his neck and his hand to take a picture of her and not a picture of you as a darker-skinned woman. You know, these are things that, and these are conversations that people are very uncomfortable with having, because it forces people to acknowledge inconsistency and privilege, and it puts them on the defensive. But these are conversations that we do need to have in terms of how we package and commercialize Carnival in a way that does not celebrate from whence it actually came in all its fullness and its glory. And that in its essence is anti-Blackness at its root. Feel free to jump in.
I was just going to say, though, because this is from bringing back what you had asked me before, that and then joining in your point of how Black is defined, and sometimes why there's a pushback against it that happened after 1970 as well. You know, that there was a pushback from, and we have writers now who are saying that that the whole joint sort of force of that march to Caroni was just one-sided. You know, there are people who are writing that now that there was little to no Indian involvement in that, and so and also a kind of response from the Indian community that Black didn't really include us, and so I think, like, even when people are talking about Black Lives Matter and how the response in Trinidad, when the very first day that there were the protests in front of the embassy, one of the signs said, would Indian families, you know, sort of welcome a Black person in their relationship, which I think had opened a lot of Indian wounds, because they felt, the community feels like, well, we are being attacked, you know, and I think it's like twofold, which is an unwillingness to interrogate that, but also an unwillingness to see why, like, that exists in the first place. You know, an unwillingness to see why Indian households are so resistant to what they perceive as somebody coming in who is not in line with not just your skin color, which does have a lot to do with it too, but also in terms of what is our culture. When you think of the ways that Indian culture has been sort of not given the prevalence that Indian people feel it deserves, or has been kind of stifled, and has then had to turn to the household as the place where it protects itself. And often that it could manifest itself in patriarchal ways. But a lot of women are the ones who, like the Mrs. Tulsi's in V.S. Naipaul's book in House of Mr. Biswas, are the ones like holding up these systems on their backs with their economic power as well, and holding the money tin, and they're the ones going to the temples. You go in a temple, sometimes you won't find a single man, except for the pandit, which is a weird way of how the patriarchy is also working, you know, with women. So I think like this unwillingness on both ends to interrogate, because what the Indian community sees first is attack. And then when they feel attacked, then they're just gonna go shut it down, you know? And it's hard then to build any kind of bridge. And that's why what I feel is real community exchange, like talk, is something that's so missing from, and that's why until as much as you or have the respect for Ravi G. Me as well, because of many people in the community, he is the one who has been engaging voices across the board and then bringing back these voices to our community. That if it wasn't for him, I don't know what my experience then would have been like. So I think these are all things that are very difficult to unpack, and mostly because it's uncomfortable and people don't want to speak about it, So yeah.
You bring up another interesting point, and I really want us to tell if we can tackle this before we run out of time. And then talk about the patriarchy. And one of the questions was looking at gender discrimination or inequality or inequity. Is that a problem in Trinidad? That's an almost rhetorical question. And is it prevalent in Carnival?
Can I go back to 1869?
Sure.
Let's talk about the Contagious Diseases Ordinance, which required that Jamets in Port of Spain registered and had regular examinations from the medical services. It was enforced between 1872. It was suspended in 1872 and then reinstated in 1875 and finally outlawed in 1887. One of the things that was a feature of this Contagious Diseases Ordinance, particularly in the 1880s when there was a sugar depression and people couldn't find work on plantations. So a lot of people moved into Port of Spain, into the cities. And one of the things that particularly African women learned that the marketable skill that they had due to all the sexual violence experienced during enslavement was to transact financial arrangements for the sexual use of their bodies. But one of the things that was characteristic of this time was also that the police were extremely complicit in exacting sexual favors from these prostitutes to ensure that they had their complicity with not getting tested or with not having to go and report and register, et cetera, And the amount of bacchanal that came out of that particular piece of legislation called the Contagious Diseases Ordinance is significant. And I bring that up because, we talk about the Cambodia riots. We talk about Joe Talmana. We talk about stick fighters mostly as men. But we don't talk about something that chalked us, Dr. Liverpool mentions in Rituals of Power and Rebellion, which was that the women were the ones who really was choking fire with the men for something to be done. Mm-hmm. And it would have been coming from a place of, well, actually, we facing double oppression. We are facing not just the criminalization of our bodies as Black people, we are facing the criminalization and exploitation of our bodies as Black women, right? And this is something that we haven't reached a point where we can have a conversation about. And I want to start us having these conversations about the specific experience of women and how women also insisted on having insisted on certain things going on in the society to better their conditions. So if you go even further back, you go to 1824 when they wanted to change the law and say, the Amelioration Act, and say, don't flog women anymore. And the man say, it is a monstrous and extraordinary thing that you all want us to stop flogging women because the women were the bad behaved ones. So if you had like 1,400 cases of bad behavior from men, you had twice as many from the women. They talk about the mouth, the way that women express their disgust, and worse yet, in Jamaica, where they talk about women used to just laugh at these men. They used to cuss, they used to raise up their clothes and shake their bottom in people's face. That was the insult that they had. So again, coming back to the beginning of the conversation about using your body as a site of rebellion, and if rebellion still exists in Carnival, the best video I saw this year was of a woman whining by the side of the road. A man came to whine on her. She got up, moved from where she was whining, went to lean up against her wall to whine on her head top. The man come back to whine on her. She twists her foot and fling him away. And I was like, that is rebellion. That is what we're talking about. This thing about my body, I do not have ownership of my body in any other time of the year. If I want to whine, let me whine. Shadow sing this, say, leave me, let me whine. I cannot resist the tempo. I'm feeling it in my big toe. This bumpsy is mine, and I feel to whine. Okay, I got my opportunity to coach Shadow, and so I'm very happy. But I mean, the thing about discrimination, gender discrimination, is it goes back a long time. And women have been fighting against it for a long time. As a flag woman in Tree Canal, there have been years when I roll up my flag and beat people because they come in to whine and you don't want to whine. This is my agency as a flag woman with a weapon. And this is the other thing that we have to recognize, that many times the forms that we have, they are forms of ritual violence as well. And we need to have those rituals of violence. The reason why we love certain goddesses, we love Oshun. Oshun is so beautiful and ting, ting, ting. But you know what? Oshun is the baddest warrior, right? The baddest, and her parallel, Gangamai. She had to pass through Lord Shiva Lux, because if she had hit the earth with her exact Shakti force, the earth would have been destroyed, right? So she had to be filtered through Lord Shiva's locks. So this is, I think that, this woman, Kola Buff, she says the Black woman is a meteor hurtling towards earth. And this is certainly what we have seen manifesting over and over again. And the times when we have had moments in our society where people really stand up. I mean, a 19-year-old called Beverly Jones was one of the people who was killed during NUF. She was a student of Brinsley Samaru, who met Walter Rodney in England.
Yeah.
These are the connections that we're not seeing. We're not seeing how that is like almost spiritual manifestation of energy and force, and how it has reached to where it's have to reach. I just want to say that woman in Trinidad, at some point, I had to cuss a man who was masturbating outside my house the other day.
Yes, I saw that.
I had to cuss him stink and threaten him with Obia. I'm not threatening him with police. I'm going to threaten you with Obia, because that's what I have access to. I don't trust the police to have my best interests at heart. Going back to the contagious diseases ordinance. And when you hear about women going to a police station and asking for protection because a man is beating them, you understand how they could have had a contagious diseases ordinance in 1869 that would cause ruction to people. The echoes of that are constantly, and you have somebody who is who is supposed to be responsible, and you never give an explanation as to why you have killed a pregnant woman. Never.
It's so funny you talk about the Jamet because I remember seeing, I didn't see it in person, I didn't see the video, but I saw people talking about it, and they were all shook and offended because there was apparently a woman in one of the protests that happened a couple of weeks ago. Was 2 weeks ago now? 2 weeks? Yeah.
Yeah.
Raise up she dress and show the police she panty. And I'm like, if y'all don't see that as a direct hand-me-down from Jamet culture and you don't understand the context of what it is we're saying right now, and I don't know what else to do at this point. You know what I mean? But I in terms of gender discrimination, for me, it's not necessarily a discrimination when I think about it. You see the way, again, going back to the way we package Carnival, and we can have conversations of ownership versus objectification. And for me, there's real power in a woman being able to take ownership of her body on the road. And if she want to walk down the road in a wire bra and a thong, that is her Carnival experience. That is her Carnival experience. And her body should not be subjected to anything that she doesn't want it to be subjected to while she walks and whines and waylays her body on Carnival Monday and Tuesday in Hawaii bra and a thong. So there's that level of ownership, so to speak, in terms of the female body as resistance during Carnival. But then there's also a concerning way in terms of how we package and sell Carnival. And that says that there are certain bodies that are more valuable than others, which again intersects the place the woman holds with the othering and the exoticism and the colorism and all of those kinds of things. So when we think about women in the Carnival space, again, it can't be thought of in one way or in a vacuum, because then you also have other women who've been powerful griots and chantwells and calypsonians coming down through the decades as well, who have formed part of the consciousness of the festival through the decades. So there's no, for me, women don't have a sense of powerlessness within our Carnival. I think women have led the rebellion and the resistance in many ways, but I do have concern and give it copious amounts of side eyes year after year in terms of how we package Carnival that validates one female form more than other, whether it's the color of the female form or the shape of the female form, because we know that there's a particular shape that comes with a certain demographic, you know what I mean? So yeah, and Eurocentric ideas of what beauty is within the festival, because we've made it a festival that's very beauty based in a lot of ways. So when we start to think about what beauty means to us as it pertains to the female form, for me, that's really important when we're talking about the role of women within the festival and within the resistance.
I'm being shown a very large clock.
Right, all right, okay, we finished.
So I want to leave. I want to do two things before we cut off. First, I want you all to pat yourselves on the back. Marie says, thank you so much for this discourse, for this discussion, and gratitude for all of your power and brilliance. These global connections are so needed. Sending love from New York City.
Oh, bless you.
Oh, sure.
So we could dust ourselves off with that. And I want to end then as a wrap up with, can Carnival fulfill its function as rebellion if we move to an online event, to a digital space? If part of the ritual involves being with people, is it possible to evoke this revolution, this rejuvenation, if we're in an online platform?
I think like what Abea was talking about before about stripping it away, like that's something that I had thought about. That if you now, what are the capitalists going to benefit from? You know, if you move it to an online space, then you have to kind of strip away a lot of the beading and the feathers and that kind of thing and the glitter to see what was there before you superimpose this thing on it, you know. So so like that's one thing. But then like the other concern is even if you're going to an online space, when you think about things like resources and who has access to resources and who has access to the internet and who are the voices because if you are like when Old Mass is there, if you're playing Juve, anybody can come, and they don't have to access anything. And they go to the road and they play their mass and they play themselves. But now you're not even gonna. How is that authenticity then of this anybody just walking up and doing what they want? How is that going to be translated to an online platform? How are they going to access it? So that in terms of economics, there are those two things that the very rich maybe the sort of corporate interests may be eliminated, but also the voices that you need to hear as well may not get a chance to air itself.
Like I said, I keep, and for the same reasons, in a lot of ways as Anila, grapple with how exactly is an online carnival going to work. And I think the more I think about it, it probably means the two carnivals will continue to exist, which means there will be an online version of what corporate can feel they can package. But then there will also be the one that goes back into the communities in small ways, and it becomes less about producing a festival and more about playing the mass and manifestation in the mass and when I say manifestation, it means for me it would mean that whatever is happening in the society at the time would play a huge role in how the carnival and the mass would then manifest in those various communities. It may mean that that particular version of the carnival may not necessarily make it into the online version, so to speak, but it will still have resonance because we understand how the conversation goes. And then too, even if people don't necessarily have online access, somebody always have a phone. Somebody could always go live, or at least it will generate conversation, so to speak, in those online social media platforms. But I do think that whatever happens this year, again, will allow us to just kind of strip things back and take control of the narrative. It's going to be really interesting to see how those classist lines manifest themselves in other ways in this new version, because they will. It doesn't mean that it will disappear entirely, but it's going to be, I'm excited to see what happens on the ground, so to speak, and a return, or maybe not necessarily a return, but a new manifestation of the original intent of what Carnival was originally about in terms of resistance and continuing the rebellion and the revolution that started all the way back in 1881.
It'll be interesting to see how like social media, because I'm thinking about like I'm thinking about like the whole COVID situation is so rich for Old Mass. Come out but how are they going to translate? And then I'm thinking about people like Rody and his characters and how many people have access to things like phones and so on. And if we will be able to see that, like if we'll be able to see TikTok videos or Instagram kind of posts of people that are taking like, their experience in this whole thing and then putting it forward as mass through these mediums, what will that look like? I don't
know. In the same way, I think that meme culture has kind of taken over how we would have seen like the Calypsonian as that person who immediately responds to a situation, whether it's, in extempo style. I mean, I feel like the people who do memes are like the extempoers, the extempo artists of this generation digitally. Yes. I am not necessarily worried about how it manifests itself, just that all the forms of it get an opportunity to manifest themselves. And right. I would say that whoever decides whether they have in Carnival or not, the people who want Carnival to happen for themselves, it will happen. I mean, you know, there are countless years of us insisting, fighting with NCC on a carnival Monday morning, Juve morning, to get on the stage, right? Tricanal, to get on the stage Juve morning, right? There is nobody in the stands at 6 o'clock in the morning. But there is something about the magic, the phobia of being able to cross that stage. And you know, what I like is actually to run ahead of everybody and throw a little rum on the stage and have that kind of quiet moment and wait for, you know, hear the sound of Lavender Rhythm section coming up the track and have that little quiet moment of ancestral reflection. That's important for me. It's not necessarily about having 10,000 Blue Devils coming down, but the actual acknowledgement that this is a sacred time. This is a special time for us. And that can happen whether or not, irregardless, as Merriam-Webster say that's a word.
Irregardless, it is a word.
Regardless of whether there are 50,000 people or 2 people. And there was another thing that I wanted to say, which I cannot remember now because I was actually sipping rum in this cup. What is this I was going to say? I can't remember. But it was just to make the point again that, right, this was it. In World War II, there was no carnival for 5 years. However, every year there was a road march. And then on VE Day, on VJ Day, Pan was in the road. So the 5 years that had been taken of no parade, you had an opportunity for the people who were makers and doers to create something that when they finally got an opportunity to go out on the road, people were blown away by what this thing was. You know, and this is the exciting thing that I feel like this moment offers us, that whether carnival happens or not in a way that capitalists can benefit from it, it is an opportunity for us to see what it means to us and see what is the next manifestation, how it grows, how it develops, how it becomes more relevant and more resonant to our current realities and what we need as a people, what transformation and healing and what we need to get from the carnival that we're not getting in its current form.
I think one word I'll take away from this phrase is manifestation of energy. I think Abeo said that. I really like that phrase, manifestation of energy. I feel like that sort of encapsulates carnival, manifestation.
Absolutely.
Well, ladies, the clock is ticking down. I think this was a very fruitful conversation. I hope we can continue this conversation moving forward because we're nowhere near finished. We're nowhere near resolved. And I think these are things that we need to keep in our heads as we move forward. And so I want to thank you personally, but I'm going to hand it over to Chrison to do the vote of thanks because apparently we have overstayed our time.
No, let's start late. Well, it started at 1:47. So technically, no. You know, I'm
just saying, I'm not buffing. I just I will also point out that I never finished on time. I need a very fluid concept. I don't believe in it. I'm going to hand it over to Chrison now.
When the ancestors say it finish, it finish.
Yes.
Right. So, thank you so much, Kella. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a brilliant conversation. I'll talk to all you afterwards. We have something.
Okay.
Very well, ma'am.
Right, so handing it over to Chrison.
Oh boy, that was really quite an enriching experience. Full of, I think, one of the things that jumped out to me. You said, Anila, that you remember manifestation of energy. Somewhere very early on, someone spoke about cultural persistence.
Yeah.
And I think in a very real way, that is at the heart of what Carnival is for us. And Kayla said as well that, it's a space where we can all bring what we need into that space. And that is why I think it's such a rich space for cultural persistence. Really, ladies, thank you very much. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your experiences. We really had a very wonderful afternoon with you. I think we should see now up on the screen a flyer for another conversation, which we will host next week, Saturday. We're going to do it on Saturday morning. We're going to do it a little differently. We're having a Zoom meeting so that anyone that's interested could come into the meeting. We're all going to have a chat. We want to talk about our Carnival Studies program so that all our instructors will be there. Dr. Francis, Dr. Liverpool, Dr. Otley, and Mrs. Fitzpatrick. We really recognize Carnival as something very important for us in Trinidad and Tobago and across the diaspora. And as was mentioned earlier in the conversation, the whole question of education, Carnival, yes, the education happens anyway, but some of that education is not really what it needs to be. Some of us need to know a little more. Some of us are really thirsting for further information and to really have a proper grasp of what this energy is and how we can harness it. And so we really hope some of you can come in next Saturday. Please join us on Facebook so that you can follow the Academy. You can send us an email at theacademy@utt.edu.tt just to find out more. If you possibly don't remember everything that I'm saying today, send me an email and ask me, theacademy@utt.edu.tt. Thank you, Dr. Francis. Thank you, Abeo. Thank you, Anila. Thank you, Attila, the Juveist. Thank you, of course, to those of you who joined us, who came in and saw and commented, and even the ones who didn't comment and didn't ask a question. I know that having experienced this, that you will definitely have found it as enriching as I did. Again, thank you.